Hey everyone, and welcome back. So we've gone over a few of the basic tools in Photoshop. You learned how to use the Move tool, the Zoom tool, and the Crop tool. And in this video, we're going to be covering some of the selection methods that are available in Photoshop. Now, any application that has the ability to manipulate images needs one or two tools to help isolate specific areas of a photo. Now, it just so happens that Photoshop has a plethora of these tools. Over the next few minutes, we're going to be covering many of the common selection methods in Photoshop, starting with the marquee tools. Photoshop contains 4 marquee tools, but we're really only going to be covering 2 of them, the rectangular and the elliptical marquee tool. And as you may have guessed, these 2 tools allow you to select areas of your photo using a square or rectangle or an ellipse. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? And for the most part, it is. And just like your other tools in Photoshop, you can find these in the tools bar to the left. You'll probably either see the rectangular or elliptical marquee tool currently active, and if you hold your mouse button down, you can reveal the other marquee tools. Now, when you select either of these 2 tools, as long as you have a raster layer selected, which is basically a photo or a flattened shape, you can drag your mouse to create a selection. And by default, these selections are not constrained, which means you can make a rectangle or an oval if you want. But if you want a perfect square or a perfect circle, make sure to hold down your Shift key on your keyboard. And when you release your mouse to make that selection, you should see what are called marching ants running around the selected area. So anything inside of these ants will be your active selection. Pretty straightforward so far, but of course, like many of the tools in Photoshop, there are other options that you could find on the options bar at the top of your workspace. Let's go over some of those options now. The first button is your standard Create a New Selection option. When this is selected, dragging your mouse on your document will create a new selection, and if there was one previously, it would discard that selection to make the new one. The second option will add to your selection. Now, if you have a previous selection on your document already, dragging your mouse will add a new marquee to the selections which have already been created. You can also trigger this option by holding down your Shift key. So if you have your first option selected, the Create New Selection option, and you want to add to that selection without having to check on the second option, you can very easily hold down your Shift key and create a new selection to add to the current selection. Now, the next option will do the opposite. This is the Subtract from Selection button. Dragging out a selection will remove that area from the current selection. This can also be triggered with your Option key on the Mac or Alt key on Windows. Finally, we have the Intersect with Selection option. Dragging out a marquee on top of a current selection will result in a selection that contains only what was common between the 2. So even if you drag your intersecting selection outside of the original selection, the resulting selection will only be made up of the original selection. Were you able to follow that? Probably not, but hopefully the visual that you're seeing on the screen right now explains it a little bit better. The next option that's available to us on the options bar is feathering. Now, you may have used feathering in the past. Essentially, feathering is the ability to soften out the edges of your selection. Now, when you're working with a circular marquee, which I'll show you in a second, you're really not going to see the effect of the feathering value until you fill in that selection. So let me start with the rectangular marquee tool. I'm going to increase the feather value to around 5 pixels and then drag out a selection. You'll notice that this time, instead of a perfectly sharp square, we now have a nice rounded corner. And if I go ahead and fill in this selection using either the Paint Bucket tool or Command or Control Delete on my keyboard, you can see that the edges are now nice and soft. And as I continue to increase the feather value and create new selections, the edges will become softer and softer. Now, grabbing the circular marquee tool, we're going to do the exact same thing. Let me increase the feather value to, let's say, 20 pixels, and I'm going to drag out a selection. Now, you're going to notice that it looks identical to how it would look if the feather value was at 0. At least it will until you fill in that selection. So once again, Command or Control Delete on the keyboard, and now you can see the result of the feather value. The edges are a lot softer and a lot blurrier than it would be with the feather value at 0. So the bottom line is, if you're looking to feather or smooth or blur out the edges of your selection, either from the image that you're working on or something that you're going to be filling in with a foreground or background color, you'll want to increase the feather value to soften out those edges. However, I will note, the feather option on the options bar will not further feather your selection. So if you already have a selection made and you increase that feather value to, let's say, 40, it will not increase the feather value on your current selection. If you want to modify your current selections, you'd have to go up to the select menu, down to modify, and then choose the feather option to increase your feather value. Our next option is anti-alias. Now, this checkbox is only going to be available when you have the circular marquee tool active. You're going to come across the anti-alias feature in many areas of Photoshop. And for the most part, when you see the anti-alias option, it allows you to smooth out the edges of an object or layer style. Now, it doesn't smooth it out like feathering does, which is more of a blur, but it smooths it out so you have a nice curve instead of sharp edges. So if I make sure my feather value is at 0 and I fill in this circular selection and I zoom in a little bit, you may see that the edges are a little bit sharp. So now let me go ahead and turn on anti-alias and make another circular selection. This time I'm going to fill it in once again and zoom in. You're going to notice that the edges are now a little bit smoother than they were before. They're not as sharp and jagged. And again, you're going to see this option in many areas of Photoshop, including your layer styles. And it's usually a good idea to keep this checked on so your edges are nice and smooth. Finally, the last options that are available to us on our options bar help us when we're actually creating our selections. The style option defines how your selection will be created. There are 3 options to choose from. Normal gives you complete dragging control over the width and the height. You can simply drag out a selection on your document in any direction that you choose. However, if you want a little bit more constraint, you can choose either fixed ratio or fixed size. And these options are very similar to the ones that you saw in the crop tool. The fixed ratio option gives you the ability to define the width and the height as a ratio rather than a fixed size. For example, for a rectangular marquee selection, you may enter 6:4, and when you drag out your selection, it's going to constrain at a 4:6 aspect ratio. But if you're looking to create a selection based on a specific width and height, you want to select the fixed size option. Fixed size allows you to, do just that. And when specifying the width, height, or both, you're free to use any of the Photoshop supported units, inches, centimeters, pixels, and so on. And once your dimensions are set, a simple click on your document will create a selection at that size. Now there is one more option on your options bar, which is refine edge, but we're going to discuss that in the next video, and I'm going to show you exactly how that can work for complex selections in Photoshop. The next selection tools that we're going to be discussing are the lasso tools, which again you can find in your tools bar to the left. When we discussed the marquee tools, they were great if you were looking for simple rectangular or circular selections. However, if you're looking for slightly more flexibility with your selections, the lasso tools may help you out. There are 3 lasso tools that we're going to be covering. The first one is the standard lasso tool. This is the most basic of the bunch. This lasso tool gives you the ability to create freehand selections. Now, most users, unless they're using a tablet or have a very steady hand, will find this tool quite difficult to use. To complete a lasso selection, you may either end your drawing where you began or simply let go of your mouse. Photoshop will close off the selection for you. This lasso tool is great if you're not too concerned about specific selections. If you're trying to select something off of a transparent background and there's not much else in the way, this tool may be perfect. Next is the polygonal lasso tool, and as the name suggests, the polygonal lasso tool uses straight edges in order to create a selection. Now, unlike the lasso tool, selections are not made with an uninterrupted mouse stroke. They are instead created with individual clicks, creating each edge. This selection method is perfect if you're needing to select objects which primarily contain straight edges. And the final tool we're going to look at is the magnetic lasso tool. This tool is really neat, but it can also be limiting at times. The magnetic lasso tool works by sticking to the edges of objects you're trying to select. Because of this, your subject needs to have pretty defined edges, either straight lines or sharp color changes. Once you make your initial point by left-clicking, simply move your mouse slowly around your object. And as long as the edges of the object are quite defined, you should see your selection path being created. And to complete the selection, either make your way back to the beginning or double-click to close off the selection. The last 2 selection methods that we're going to be covering in this video are the Magic Wand tool and the Quick Selection tool. These 2 selection methods gives you the ability to select certain areas of your photo based on color. While they're both very similar, they also have their advantages. Let's start with the Magic Wand tool. This tool is probably one of the most common selection methods in Photoshop. If you're looking to select large clumps of a color in an image, you may want to give this a shot. When your Magic Wand tool is active, starting your selection is simple. Click on an area that you want to turn into a selection. Photoshop will compare the surrounding area and select everything that's similar in color, based on the tolerance value on the options bar. A higher tolerance value will result in a broader selection, while a lower value will result in a very specific selection. When you make your initial selection, you may be left with either too much or too little of your desired area selected. When you run into a situation where you want to add or remove from your selection, you can add, subtract, or intersect your selection, just like you could with your other tools. To speed up your workflow, you can also use shortcut keys. To add to your selection, hold down your Shift key, both on the Mac and Windows. To subtract from the selection, hold down your Option key on the Mac or Alt key on Windows. And to intersect, it's Option and Shift or Alt and Shift. A nice addition to the Magic Wand tool in Photoshop CS6 is the sample size option on the options bar. In previous versions of Photoshop, when you left-click to make your initial selection, Photoshop sampled that single color that you clicked on and used that to start the selection. Now in Photoshop CS6, you're able to sample a larger area, which can result in more accurate selections. Next, let's take a look at the Quick Selection tool. Now, similar to the Magic Wand tool, the Quick Selection tool also creates selections based on similar colored areas. However, instead of single-clicking to create the selection, the Quick Selection tool uses a click and drag method similar to a brush. While the end result will be very similar to what you would have achieved with the Magic Wand tool, this approach can be certainly quicker. And while both these tools do a really nice job at selecting areas of a similar color, your selections may not come out perfect. That's why in the next video, we're going to take a look at color range and refine edge, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can use both of those tools to get very accurate selections in Photoshop. We'll see you soon.